This is Rebuilders, the leaders we need for the decade ahead. We all know change is a constant. It's just how fast, intensely, and inequitably the change around us is accelerating. As we move into the decade ahead, economic, social, and health inequalities will have created an increasingly uneven and siloed America. These changes didn't start with the events of 2020. They've been accelerating for over a generation. And now, technology, media, and COVID are amplifiers dividing us in ways we've never seen before. Our leaders need to adapt. The future of our communities and our world depend on it. But the ways we thought about leadership in the past will not get us to where we want to go in the future. America is at an inflection point, and if the right leaders show up, we will emerge from the decade ahead stronger and a better nation for everyone. This is Rebuilders, the leaders we need for the decade ahead. Here's your host, Paul Shoemaker.
Just a quick note up front. For the first 8 minutes or so of my conversation with Cecilia, you'll hear that my audio sounds a little bit weird. That's my fault. Don't let it distract you. Just listen to Cecilia anyway. So welcome to this edition of Rebuilders, the leaders we need for the decade ahead. My guest today is a very unique leader that I want you to get to know, Cecilia Gutierrez. Thank you for joining me today, Cecilia.
I'm so happy to be here, Paul. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So I start off each episode with the same question. When you think about the years ahead from where you sit, what do you think are the one or two personal leadership attributes that we're going to need most in this world of social and community change? What stands out for you?
I think the two that I was thinking about, Paul, and then I'll go into specific about both, but I was thinking courage and vulnerability were the two that I wanted to offer. On courage, here's what I would say. We're living in a deep awakening, right? 2020 turned everything upside down for us. There was not only COVID and what we all had to deal with, and almost every single person around the world has been impacted and has their own COVID story. But there was also the racial reckoning that was taking place at the same time that we were also in isolation and witnessing this, including the insurrection that happened on January 6th in 2021 that will live with us. And so I think almost all of us have to be courageous, have to use our voice, have to be willing to name things that are deeply uncomfortable for us to name, have our own reckoning as individuals and how we're showing up in the world, and then how we are then driving a different set of conversation as a result of the shared experience that we have all been through in 2020 and even continuing to 21. So I would say like courage, and I haven't always been courageous, but that's the one thing that I think more than anything we need from leaders right now. And then vulnerability, which is, Brene Brown talks a lot about this, but I think it's like admitting what you don't know that allows others to name what they don't know and allow us to solution together in shared knowledge and build on each other's knowledge and this deep awakening and awareness that collectively we have a better solution than on our own. And that in order to show up and be willing to kind of solve solution is first entering and saying, I know this part, but I don't know this. What do you know, Paul? And how do we invite one another into a conversation in which we are really solutioning together and building on each other's knowledge? And I think that takes both courage and vulnerability to name. So those are the two things that I would offer.
That's powerful. Those two things could almost sound contradictory at face value.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
That's probably the power of it.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
We'll come back to that part about your own courage in a minute. So let's talk about your journey. Your professional career, you sort of really stuck your feet in the ground in Miami for 10 years. So just tell us a little bit about the two organizations you worked with there and the work you did so we have some context.
Yeah, so let me maybe back up a little bit to say, Paul, my journey as a career and professional comes from someone who grew up poor and was the beneficiary of programs that invested in poor Black and brown children. So I just want to name that because I am someone who benefited from programs that I feel like I've been leading and have been a part of, almost as a way of paying it forward and almost as a way of saying there aren't enough programs to lift brown and Black children specifically from vulnerable communities out of poverty. I am witness to what happens when someone does that for you. And I feel like I have an entire career that speaks to like my way of paying it forward. So like I got a scholarship to go to college and I would not have gone to college without a scholarship. And I got to college because I had a bunch of people who said, you need to learn how to write an application. You need to learn how to interview. You need to have powerful essay. Let us help you. Without that network of support, I would be nowhere. I just want to name that. So I would say the two organizations that I've led are things that I'm deeply passionate about. When I think about what gets me up running in the morning, it's like, could I be a voice? Could I join forces with others around the world and in this country specifically to lift people out of poverty? I've always been cognizant of like, I don't want to work for the poor. I want to lift them out of poverty. I want them to have the same things that middle class and upper middle class people have. And how do we make that happen for them? So the first organization that I led in Miami was Breakthrough Miami, and I was recruited to lead their expansion effort. Breakthrough Miami takes motivated middle schooler, really sixth graders, and says, we think you're college material in sixth grade because you're motivated and willing to work hard. And we're going to put you on a path for post-secondary education. And by the way, not just to go to college, but go to the best colleges. And then what Breakthrough does, the combination of like a highly motivated sixth grader, and then they take talented college students and they pair them up. And that's where the magic happens. Because all of a sudden you are witnessing in front of you who you want to be. And they're so cool that you really want to go to college, because if college is that cool teacher that you have, then that's who you want to be. So I led that organization and loved it and still deeply believe in the power of like what you must do to move people out of college to post-secondary education. The love of my life, though, I would say, was Miami Children's Initiative. And I literally ran to the projects every day. I know that sounds strange because who wants to run to the projects? But I literally ran to the projects every day where I heard on average 25 gunshots a day, where my children and families heard 25 gunshots a day. And I ran to this place and I ran to this community because the children and families were so like, Paul, they were gifts to the nation that were being kept in a community that has been historically disinvested. And so the nation was never going to witness their gifts and promise because we have kept them in poverty and have been disinvesting in them and their schools and their community. And I was dealing with children and families that grew up in public housing and never got out, and were 3 and 4 generations of families growing up in public housing, right? And we used the framework of the Holland Children's Zone to essentially say, in this place, in this 620 something blocks where 16,000 children 0 to 21 years old reside, could we almost shift the entire neighborhood by investing in the promise of our children, by giving them an opportunity to realize their greatest potential? Because it's not them that don't realize their greatest potential. The system was set up so that we could never benefit from them. And yes, in this country, we have seen what happens to kids like me that get a benefit. Like we get 1 or 2 kids get cherry picked into a possibility of realizing their greatest potential. But that's not a strategy. That's just luck. That's 1 or 2 of us pulling people out of that vessel. And what I really loved about Miami Children's Initiative, and what I really have modeled around Jeffrey Cannon, the Harlem Children's Zone, is like,
one of the things I'm going to suggest you listen to over the course of this conversation is just how much deeper the degree of insight from Cecilia grows as the conversation goes along. you'll hear where her generosity mindset comes from. You'll hear it in her spirit. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book and I do this podcast is I just want people to know there are leaders like her out there. And by the way, when she starts talking about the kids in a few minutes, just listen to how the energy in her voice rises when talking about kids.
Could you take a place? And could you invest in all the children in that space and allow them to lead them that trajectory? So that's the work that I would say. I love that work. I still think about that work. I think the work that I'm doing at Blue Meridian is in support and in service of that work that I did in that community for so many years.
So thanks for sharing your early years. And clearly, the work you did those 10 years, and especially the last 4, that took a ton of courage. I'm interested in the 10 years you did those 2 gigs. These were sort of the formative years of your professional career. What did you learn about leadership doing that work? I guess in particular, the last 4 years, what did you learn about leadership being in those communities, in those situations?
That's such a great thing. So, Paul, I was in an earlier discussion today about impostor syndrome, and that essentially 70% of the country has some kind of an impostor syndrome, right? Because of my journey and how I grew up, I would just name, I never felt like I was enough. As a woman of color, as a Latina in this space, growing up and seeing career, I modeled my behavior, my attire against what I thought a white woman, a successful white businesswoman would look like.
Yep.
So I would say the last 10 years of my career in Miami was I came into my own. I came into my own as a Latina. I came into my own as a professional. I realized that who I was, my lived experience matter. And for so long, I would say in my 20s and 30s, I tried to hide it. I didn't value my lived experience. I didn't value it because I thought the nation didn't value it and that the business community didn't value it. So I hid it. I didn't talk about it. I just acted as if, or acted like I thought was being asked of me, or what I saw the world model. I would say I really came into my own. And the way that showed up for me, Paul, was what I noticed immediately when I walked into the community of Liberty City is that we were not lifting each other up as individuals. We were not, words matter. What my children and family were hearing was not love. It was demeaning. It was not appreciation. It was not valuing who they were. So what I learned the most as a leader was like showing love, giving hugs, telling someone that they matter, speaking to them in words of affirmation, being a light, smiling, like being positive, like demonstrating that there are gifts in this world. And even if you're in them, laughing, like all that stuff mattered. And it mattered that I showed up in a way that I was accessible to my children and families, that lifted them up, that valued their experience and brought my experience together to drive change. So I just think that that's like, I don't think that I did that in my previous career. I really showed up in that way for children and families when I was in Miami.
There's so much in what you're describing so far that I've talked to you a little bit before. It all is part of who you are so much. You talked about imposter syndrome. We've all felt it. You still feel it sometimes? Or have you sort of conquered that?
No, Paul, I just want to know I'm 47 years old. I'm still not fully over it. I still, to this day, at times don't feel good enough.
Yep. Join the club. So from there, you went on and you did a handful of years at My Brother's Keepers Alliance, and you were the director of partnerships, and you just exude partnerships. What did you do in that role?
So I think the best way that I can describe it is every single network that was a part of My Brother's Keeper wanted to be seen, wanted to be heard, wanted to be lifted up, wanted to share their learning, their struggles. And so for me, I think what I was trying to do more than anything was to say, you took on this important challenge that the president made to the nation as a result of George Zimmerman being acquitted of Trayvon Martin's murder. And you're trying to do something really brave in your community by having that particular community focus around boys and young men of color and lifting them up as saying, yes, everybody matters, but actually we have to do something different for boys and young men of color here. And oftentimes in that partnership role, I was dealing with leaders that were alone, that had very little resources, that were like, it was just one of those things where like everyone took on the challenge and everyone showed up in different ways. And my job was to make sure that folks knew that there was a network that was associated with that, where we can, again, lean on one another, share our knowledge, figure out what mattered, what we could do to really make a difference for boys and young men of color in each one of those communities. So I think I loved working on Marvin's Key for. I still feel deeply that this nation must do something uniquely different for boys and young men of color.
So for anybody listening, you've heard this journey so far, and even though you can't look at Cecilia like I can, I think somebody listening has a feel for who you are. So today, I'm going to interrupt myself here just for a moment to say two things. The first one is she used the expression, "Don't feel like I was enough," multiple times. The only way I have ever experienced Cecilia Gutierrez is as a force of nature. And the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm just going to shut up. Her conversation will make generosity mindset real. She'll tell you how she operationalizes it. And sometimes in a great sports announcer at the end of a thrilling game will just shut up and let the scene play out and let the viewer watch and listen to it and not insert his own comments. So that's exactly what I'm going to do for the rest of this podcast. And in the book, by the way, Cecilia's in a chapter I call Generosity Mindset. So I've been in a bunch of meetings with you over the last couple of years. Just in general, when you walk into a particular meeting, how do you see your role? What are you trying to do? What are you trying to bring to that room, that group of people?
I do two things, and I'm very intentional about it, Paul. So one is I walk into a room thinking every single voice matters. And I feel that it is my job and responsibility to invite and make space for all those voices to be heard. And then the second thing that I do is very much similar to that is, how do I create space where every single member that's around the table thrives, feels like they belong, and lifts each other up and builds on one another's points? Like, so that to me feels like I am really intentional about what's my role in shining the light on someone else's gifts and talents. And I try to work to be in the background so that other people's light can shine and make space for that.
So there are not many people that walk into meetings or walk into groups thinking that way. That's why it's so critical. I know you won't want to answer this question, but what is Cecilia's superpower?
Okay, Paul, I got stuck on this one. I was like, what is my superpower? So here's my best answer to this, and it might not be adequate, but I think I assume good intentions. I just really believe that if I am encountering you, that you have my best interest at heart and that I have your best interest at heart. And until you show me differently, that is my superpower. I'm going to assume that you are good and that you mean well and that the things that I care about, you care about, and that you equally want to be heard the same way that I want to be heard. And because that is I would say that is my superpower. At times I will say that folks might equate that to being naive, which I have been accused of, right? Because of my willingness to see the best in people. At times, I might not be seeing Machiavellian behavior that could be really detrimental to something that we are trying to accomplish. But I do assume good intention. And I would say that is my superpower. Until you show me differently, I'm assuming you are a good person.
That's a powerful idea. I was in a lot of meetings and groups and conversations with Cecilia, and you create a certain kind of feeling. I couldn't have put words to it. You just put words to it. You just explained why those conversations and those meetings felt the way they did. For you to be the best leader you can be and work in the way that you work, what are the biggest hurdles for you today? What holds you back? What hurdles have you got to get over?
I'm going to speak from the lens of just being a woman of color. And not just being a woman of color, but also being a woman of color who just grew up poor. And I think that has been, I don't know, I've met lots of people who grew up poor, who enter a different economic bracket and still struggle with this. I know that I personally struggle with this. So I would say it's this feeling really that you might not have been the best one to make it out of the neighborhood to be able to advance the work. It's this feeling that they picked the right person to give a scholarship to go to college. Was there someone brighter, more talented, more hardworking than me who should have been given that opportunity? And I would say that, like, I'm so aware of it. It kind of makes me want to weep a little bit because I'm so aware of, like, just the disinvestment that this country has made around children simply because they were born poor and were never given the opportunity to realize their greatest potential. And I'm just sitting with that a lot lately. I've been sitting a lot with, like, what it means to know that you're better, to know that you're more confident, to know that you have great abilities, and to never realize that in this lifetime. And so I just feel I probably, as a leader, I'm just so aware of it and bring it probably to everything that I do. And I wonder if it holds me back a little bit.
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah.
It's definitely part of what makes you who you are.
And now what I was going to say there, Paul, is as a woman of color, I just, there are still not enough Latinas in the rooms that I am in. And one of the things that I'm thinking about a lot is, how are we making more space? How am I making space? How am I lifting up other Latinas that are coming up, other women of color? How are we making sure that there is room at the table for more of us there? And what's my role in making sure that I'm doing that?
People like you are powerful role models. When you describe that, Cecilia, if this expression's too harsh, just say so. Is there some of the feeling in there of you're not good enough to be where you are? Or does that say it too harshly?
No, I think that's exactly right.
Okay. Wow. That's really something to absorb. Growing up as a middle class, but white male, that wasn't a feeling I ever had to feel very often. Right? That's the privilege I got. It's a privilege I have to this day.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that with us.
You know, Paul, that's the conversation though, right? Like when I talk about vulnerability or naming things, it's like, like you don't carry that with you and I do. But when we come into the same space together, both of those experiences should be valued and should inform that work. We should both understand that we're entering with that. And I have a deep appreciation for you saying that and how that might shape the way you speak, your own point of view, how you deliver a message, and how I might do the same. And somehow our journeys, right? Like for some reason, the universe saw fit that we should be in the same space together around the same body of work, and that holds equal value. And that's the thing that I'm like, how do we name that for one another? And how do we demonstrate to one another that actually we can advance and accelerate the work as a result of that?
Wow. So in the book, I define what generosity mindset means. If anybody's listened to the last 15 minutes, you just got an amazing definition of generosity mindset. One or two more things to ask you. If you could share one or two pieces of leadership advice with the 20-something emerging leader, and let's say probably an emerging Latina leader today, what would you share with her about how she should lead and how she should think about leadership?
Yeah. So I have two examples that I'll name. So the first one is sit at the table. right? And I remember when I first started out in my career, I was working for the New York City Board of Education. All the board members sat at the table and everybody else sat around the table.
Around the side.
And then when you looked around, right, it was all women. And I always asked permission to sit at the table. I always did in my 20s and 30s. I no longer ask permission to sit at the table, but that would be my number one thing is I don't ask permission to this table, just sit at the table. And that's something that I wish I had learned much earlier in life, because again, it goes back to confidence and valuing your experience at the table. So that's thing one. The second thing that I would say is be prepared. And the best example that I have there is similar to had a phenomenal mentor and boss, Dr. Irving Hamer, who passed away last year. And I worked for him when I was getting my master's degree in public administration. He was a brilliant, he was a genius. And I remember early on in my career coming to him with an agenda, a bunch of policy briefs related to bilingual education, related to a ton of topics. And he said, well, Cecilia, what's your opinion? What's your opinion on this? And Paul, I sat in silence. I have not done the work to say, actually, here's what I think you should do. And he literally kicked me out of the office. He kicked me out of his office and said, do not come back here until you have a point of view and 3 recommendations for what we should do about it. That moment was life transforming for me because it showed me that here's this genius of a man who thinks that I have an opinion and a set of recommendations that he would deeply value. And I've never been given a challenge where I haven't thought deeply about it and brought at least three recommendations for what we should do about it. And I learned that early on in life. And then the third thing I would say is a little bit reflecting on like the things that I've said earlier, which is bring your entire self to the work. I hid my lived experience because I didn't value it and I didn't think others would value it. That was a big mistake. That was a mistake. Who we are, what we bring to the table, what shapes our values, what matters to us, all informs the work we do. And so bring it all at every opportunity.
The story of your mentor and what he said, there's so few leaders that are willing to have a courageous conversation like that with someone, but it can make such a huge difference. I had a few experiences just like that. Last question. You're involved in all kinds of stuff. It's 2021. Looking at the future, you optimistic? You pessimistic? Where's your head at? Where's your heart at?
I'm so hopeful. I'm grateful that I'm living at this period of time. At this moment in time, it does feel like something is happening that's going to inform and shape the rest of our country. And I think a really powerful way. And so I am so hopeful. I'm beyond optimistic, I would say, because I'm a very hopeful being in and of itself. My glass is always half full. I'm always very positive, but I'm actually incredibly excited and hopeful about the future and how hard we're all wrestling with the realities of what we've created. I read Isabel Worthinson's book, Caste, which was life transforming. I think everybody should read that book, right?
That is literally the number one book people say you ought to read.
I mean, like you have to read this book. And I was like, what we've created in this country, we did that. We created this, which means that we have the power to change it. But do we have the courage to do so? Which is why I think that's where we start. Like what we need more is the courageous leaders to say, we've created a country that is not what we should be and that doesn't bring the best of us. We have to change that. And I think we all have a role to do.
I knew the conversation with Cecilia today would be special, and it was. Thank you so much for taking the time with me today.
Paul, I'm so grateful that you included me in this book. You could have included a bunch of other people. So thank you for including me. It means a lot to me. Thank you.
You bet.
Thank you for listening to the Rebuilders Podcast. For more information, resources, and episodes, visit paulshoemaker.org. That's paulshoemaker.org.